I'm George Galloway.
And I'm Adam Gary.
And together we are the History Boys, coming to you each week to explain how we got where we are, because if we don't know how we got here, we'll never work out how to get out of here. This is a specially chosen topic, this programme, because something happened on the way to the studio. Somebody tried to censor me, or even silence me. And so we are going to look at the silencing of dissident voices, the silencing of dissident ideas, many of which, most of which, came to be regarded as the ultimate orthodoxy. Adam, you know what happened to me and my radio show on talk radio. I'm not at all comparing myself to some of the great dissidents of the past, but it just goes to show, talking to you, that there's a long history of this kind of thing. Tell us about it.
Well, that's very much the case. There's a quote attributed to the great philosopher Otto Schopenhauer, and it says the following: all great ideas pass through three stages. First, they are ignored, then they are mercilessly ridiculed, and third, they are accepted as indisputed truth. So
I look forward to that. I hope I live long enough.
Don't we all? And as we'll see, a lot of the voices in history of the people that we're going to be discussing, all were great men, some were good men, and all were equally loved and loathed during their own lifetime. Crucially, they all have one thing in common. They were all loathed by the powers that be, and all loved by those who were challenging the status quo that was defined by the powers that be.
And this goes way back, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
I mean, we're talking to ancient times.
Well, I thought we'd begin in 399 BC.
That's long enough ago.
Quite
we
so.
could probably safely, even if Ofcom were governing this, which they're not, we could probably safely discuss that.
Well, there's no Athenian consuls to write in to complain about our particular views on the death of Socrates. Socrates was, of course, someone who challenged the status quo, and he did so from a position of saying that the democratic consensus in ancient Athens had become something of a kleptocracy, and it had become corrupted by greed and avarice, men who rose to the top not because of virtue, not because of ability, not because of intelligence, but because of who they know and what they owned, a concept that I know would be totally foreign to those watching us here in 2019.
Thank God we grew out of that.
Quite so. And so he was someone who was very popular among the youth of Athens. He was seen as inspirational, and his most famous pupil and admirer was, of course, Plato, who wrote down the statements of Socrates and the dialogues that he got into. Now, eventually, he became so popular that the authorities needed to crack down on him. And while many of his students were willing to raise the funds to help him escape into exile far from Athens, where he could continue to live out his life peacefully, he demanded justice to the very end. He demanded that his words test themselves against the standards of those who deep down were unfit to judge him, but which he nevertheless insisted do judge him. The result, of course, was that he was sentenced to death, and in the famous painting by David, it shows his students who can't even watch as he proudly drinks the poison, the deadly hemlock, which ultimately took his life, and the life of the man who ushered in a new school of thinking, who brought ethics and morals into Athenian philosophy, where before that it was sophistry which dominated Athenian philosophy, where great rhetoricians were able to test minds into saying, look, it doesn't matter what's right or wrong, just use rhetoric to convince person A of concept B in order to achieve result C. Socrates said we could do better than that, and he was killed for it.
And yet the name Socrates rings through the ages. We're talking about him now, and our audience know who he is.
Absolutely.
And those who persecuted him to death are completely unknown in history.
That's certainly a theme that I think we'll see throughout delving into these great dissidents, these great free minds, in that it's actually something of a weight on one's shoulder to be a free mind, because one can run afoul of those who can physically harm them, economically harm them, socially ostracize them. Let's not forget that the Greek, the ancient Athenian term for exile was ostracism, because they broke a dish called the ostrikon, and whoever's name was on the section that was the largest piece would be sent out of Athens. But Socrates was considered too dangerous even for that.
And of course, you don't need to be sent away from Athens. Ostracism means everyone turns their back upon you, a theme which recurs throughout history. People, the populace, are invited to shun, to turn their back on some of these dissidents. Tell us more of these.
Well, sticking with the ancient theme, we now go from Greece to Rome, where one of the great senators of all time, if not the greatest of all time, Marcus Tullius Cicero. Now, Cicero was an opponent of Caesarism. He wanted to maintain republican forms of government in Rome as opposed to transition to this imperium that we all know about. Now, in Cicero's fight to preserve the republic, Mark Antony, who famously delivered the eulogy for Julius Caesar, became a sworn enemy of Cicero. Now, Cicero had one weapon that the others didn't have. The others had flotillas of ships behind them. The others had armies behind them. But Cicero had his golden tongue. He had his voice, and he was known throughout all of the learned circles of Rome and in Athens as one of the most learned men of the age. When he ultimately died, it was Mark Antony's wife who pulled out his tongue, severed it from the dead head, and poked it as many times as she could. And that is very symbolic of how these kinds of people that engage in state-sponsored censorship really feel about people who they can't compete with in a fair forum. Socrates could not lose a dialogue to those who saw fit to judge him. And likewise, Cicero died being the greatest orator, quite possibly in all of Roman history. And yet it was the severing of the tongue from the lifeless head that is remembered as this vulgar, this dastardly way in which those unworthy to stand up to someone in life are able to get their revenge only after death.
And move on from ancient Rome.
Well, bringing things to a slightly more contemporary period of time, we have the religious Reformation in Western Christianity. And there are two people with literally diametrically opposed beliefs who both were men that stood up for what they believed in very much to the bitter end. There was Martin Luther, who never intended to set up his own church, never actually intended to challenge the rule of the Roman Catholic Church in Central and Western Europe. And this is actually a theme that many people forget. Most dissidents actually begin their lives not wanting to overthrow anything, not wanting to end anything, but wanting to improve the status quo. Those who want reform are the doers, they're the makers, the creators, not the destroyers. But Martin Luther soon found out that his recommendations, his 95 Theses that he nailed to the door in 1517, it was not only not appreciated, but in 1521, he was excommunicated from the Catholic Church. My, how different European history, particularly in the 16th and 17th centuries, would have been if the Catholic Church said, let's have a dialogue with Martin Luther rather than excommunicate him. Because rather than Luther just going away, many of the princes in the Holy Roman Empire, which of course by that time was neither holy nor Roman, certainly not Roman after Luther and not an empire, they sided with Luther. This of course led to the centuries of religious warfare in Central and Western Europe, culminating in the 30 Years' War, which ended in 1648. Heaven knows when it began. We'd have to ask a mathematician for that. So Luther was someone who changed the status quo of religion in one direction against the wishes of the papacy and the emperor of this fledgling Holy Roman Empire. Around the same time, however, in England, you had Henry VIII, who wasn't particularly known as a principled man, who founded the Church of England. His Lord Chancellor, however, thought that the idea of recognizing Henry as the supreme leader of this new church simply was unlawful and unethical. And this was, of course, Sir Thomas More, later St. Thomas More. He was someone who went to his death saying, I serve God and my king, but I serve God first. He was a man who refused to be bullied, refused to be coerced, and the coercion at least began quite innocently. They said, oh, why are you complaining about this? Your position will be elevated, your riches will be increased, your prestige will be increased because you'll have to answer to one less authority figure. But for him, as a person bound by his own spiritual beliefs, he couldn't turn on what he believed was a God more powerful than man, even when that man happens to be a king. He was, of course, executed in 1535, meeting an even worse fate than Luther, who was only ostracized, only to see support amongst many of the secular authorities within the German states of the Holy Roman Empire.
I've stood on the very spot where St. Thomas More was condemned to death. It's in the Great Hall in Westminster, showing how long Parliament's been there, 2,000 years. Not as many people as should remember the sacrifice that he made. His stance was, you can't have a church based on the balls of an English king, here today, gone tomorrow. That had a certain truthfulness to it.
Well, it certainly did. And that's why you don't hear Martin Luther and St. Thomas More compared in this way, because they stood for the completely opposite things. But the difference, even perhaps in the mind of someone like More in judging Luther versus Henry VIII, is Luther, while certainly ideologically and spiritually different than any traditional Catholic, was someone who actually believed in what he thought. He didn't want to start a war. He didn't want to start a revolution. And he didn't want to diminish the power of the church. He thought he was increasing it, as many dissidents do. They think that they're trying to help the very people that destroyed them. Look, going back to Socrates. Socrates wanted to strengthen Athens by promulgating a new mentality which underlies government. He wasn't trying to undermine the young people of Athens, as his judges say. But this is what binds people of principle together. It's typically those who are opposed to great men of principle, who are those who are the first to engage in acts of barbarism and viciousness. Most reformers themselves begin life as those who want nothing more than to have their ideas heard and acted upon in a peaceful and logical way. And in this sense, Luther and More, two very different minds who existed in Europe at the same time, met a faith of, in More's case, death, and in Luther's case, partial and initial ostracism, because they stuck to their guns and they refused to just be bribed away or coerced away.
It's odd in a way that rulers, the prevailing orthodoxy of any particular period, don't learn the lessons from the past. Perhaps they needed a History Boys program to inform them of the fact that Jaw is better than war, and that if you dialogue with dissidents, you may find yourself persuaded, at least in part, by the case that they are making. Instead, they repeatedly throughout history end up bringing the whole house down on their own heads.
Absolutely. And as those who believe in a kind of Hegelian march that history is always improving, this liberal notion discredited, frankly, by both of the world wars in the 20th century, it's not only discredited by that, but it's discredited by the fact that history isn't a linear line going in a positive motion. It's a cycle. And we see these themes repeated over and over again of someone who's challenging ideas, but he's met by a challenge that is physical and surely detrimental.
And then there's Galileo and there's the Inquisition. Tell us about that.
Well, Galileo was a scientist as opposed to a philosopher or a spiritual mind, but obviously his thinking about science and about the wider universe in which we live infuriated many of those religious powers that be and philosophical powers that be. Galileo challenged the traditional notion in Europe at the time that the universe revolved around the Earth, and instead proposed a heliocentric theory which said that the Earth and the other planets revolve around the sun. Now, this was an idea itself borrowed from the great Polish scientist Copernicus, and Galileo actually tested using his telescope and using very advanced calculations to actually mathematically prove that it is Earth revolving around the sun and not the other way around. Now, at first, they more or less let him be. They sanctioned him. They reprimanded him, hoping that he'd just leave it and that his next book would be about, I don't know, Florentine architecture architecture, top 5 places to visit, or how I learned to love the Pope. Well, Galileo wasn't that sort of a mind. He needed to keep progressing. And as someone who's actually known scientists over the years, there's nothing a scientist likes less than having his ideas be reduced or even traduced to the simplistic. So naturally, he expanded upon his theories and even wrote books that, frankly, insulted the stupidity of those who didn't accept mathematical realities. Now, the Pope at the time and many others in high Italian society, in Catholic society, felt that he was insulting them, even though he didn't name those that he was trying to shame, but the message was close enough. But Italy being a bit more relaxed in the 17th century than England was in the 16th, they didn't kill Galileo, but they silenced him by forcing him to live his final years under house arrest, which for a man who, frankly, his only crime was telling mathematical truths about the beautiful universe in which we live, that's a rather ignominious way to end one's life.
And then the French Revolution and the great Voltaire, who had a word or two about this kind of thing.
Well, he really summed up the entire thing. If I can paraphrase Voltaire, I detest what the man says, but I will defend to the death his right to say it. And this, to me, is a quote that helps explain one of the differences between a civilized society and a barbarous one. In a civilized society, one can debate robustly without feeling threatened, without feeling triggered, as the kids today like to say, without feeling the need to resort to violence or economic warfare. For example, in a world where, let's say, the United Nations of today was based on this precept of Voltaire, you could have the Iranian ambassador and John Bolton, the walrus, speaking for the United States, insulting each other. You could have the Chinese and the Indian ambassadors disagreeing with each other. You could have the Venezuelan ambassador, the real one this time, disagreeing with the unelected European Union's ambassador.
Now been officially recognized as the Venezuelan ambassador.
Well, to make things even
why
better...
Why not? Anyone else can.
I've just appointed myself the head of Ofcom, so I think your troubles may well be through.
Now, a lot of people think that they take Voltaire's point of view, but when it's tested, it turns out that they will fight to the death for the right of people to speak if they like what they're saying. In other words, they think that they are splendidly liberal, but only about the views that they themselves approve of.
Well, that's very true. And as we go into the 20th century, we see this being tested over and over again, where people who talk so loudly about freedom and democracy think that they're expanding freedom by shutting someone up who says that you're not promulgating freedom by dropping bombs on the people you're trying to free. And that could apply to just about any US president since 1945. Many UK prime ministers, Tony Blair being the most particularly blood-soaked in that respect.
Yes, all these, Orwell, jumping ahead, Orwell in 1984, which was supposed to be a novel but turned into a training manual, Orwell talked about how everything was reversed, how the Ministry of War was renamed the Ministry of Peace, and how truth became lies and so on. Doublespeak, he called it. That's really the world that we came to live in the 20th century, wasn't it?
Well, I think I'd like to introduce the 20th century by quoting one of my favorite dissident American comedians, George Carlin, who talked about this doublespeak. He said, in the First World War, people came home with shell shock. The word even sounded onomatopoetic. It sounded like shell shock. Then, after the Second World War, there was battle fatigue. It almost sounds like you're just tired. And then after the Korean War and after the Vietnam War, you get post-traumatic stress disorder. It sounds so complicated. You're so far removed from this initial shell shock. And so as they debase the language, much in the way that one can debase a hard currency, to bring back a theme from a few episodes ago, people not only debase the truth, but once it can't be debased any further, they flip it around. And I think the journey into this 20th century ought to begin with one of the most interesting court cases in American jurisprudence, one that's not much talked about today, but which which is, to me, still quite fascinating. And this was the so-called Scopes monkey trial of 1925. Now, John Scopes was a school teacher in the U.S. state of Tennessee, where a law called the Butler Act, unrelated to the Education Act that would be passed in early 1940s Britain, but this act forbade the teaching of Darwinian evolution in public schools. And by public schools, I mean state schools. Again, this language. In England, a public school is very private. But
Two countries divided by a common language.
Indeed, and ideally united by a common law that neither seem to care about anymore in terms of the leadership. We'll get there soon. So John Scopes was something of a guinea pig because a group called the American Civil Liberties Union, which is still very much active, said, we will pay all of your expenses, reimburse all your fines if you say that you taught Darwinian evolution to the school children so that the state comes down on you. Lo and behold, the state does come down on him, and a fascinating trial transpires between Scopes and his lawyer, the famous Clarence Darrow, and the state's lawyer, whose name is slipping my mind at the moment, but it will...
Nothing much slips your mind, so it must be an obscure fact.
Well, William Jennings Bryan, who's actually a less obscure figure than Clarence Darrow, running for president 3 times, never winning. But his final act in the public eye, Bryan, was defending the state of Tennessee against Scopes and the American Civil Liberties Union. Ultimately, free speech lost. They said that it is perfectly right that even in a country that explicitly says in its First Amendment to its Constitution that free speech is guaranteed, that it is still permissible for the school to state that he cannot even mention the idea of Darwinian evolution, which in much of the learned world was already by 1925 accepted as truthful.
A lot of things reached the United States later than most. There was then the rise of fascism. There was a very substantial part of the world communist in both forms. I'm not equating them, but in both forms, freedom of speech and expression was at a premium. In both forms, people were persecuted for speaking against the prevailing orthodoxy. But we here in the West took a high and mighty approach to that kind of thing. And we invented human rights acts, human rights conventions, and so on. But we haven't lived up to that either, have we?
Well, ask the victims of McCarthyism. Ask the victims, particularly in the arts and entertainment industry in Hollywood and elsewhere in the U.S., who were censored by HUAC, the House Committee on Un-American Activities. Ask someone like Martin Luther King, who, when he wasn't being hated by white racists, was being hated by people across the spectrum who saw that once he achieved his dream, in a legal sense, of securing the 1964 Civil Rights Act, he was silenced and shunned and most likely killed because of the fact that he opposed the war in Vietnam, said it was unchristian, said it was unrighteous. So the same voice that was raised in favor of empowering the black man to have equality with the white man in a country whose constitution guarantees these things, he was then shut down for opposing taking away the rights and the liberties of Vietnamese people to decide their own future according to the UN recognized principle of self-determination.
And the march of that hypocrisy has been constant, and the drumbeat provided by the billionaire-owned media that we have, that and the state broadcaster, the BBC.
Well, I call it the media industrial complex, and it's also related to the academia industrial complex. People think that just because you have a media or a system of higher education that looks free, that somehow it is free. Try getting your voice heard. And I don't mean you particularly, even though you'd be a very interesting test case indeed, but any free thinker getting their voice heard on corporate-run CNN, state-run BBC, or any of the other alphabet soup organizations in between, if they disagree with the status quo. But then again, the US and Britain and Europe are free places, so free that Julian Assange, a man who exposed war crimes, the truth of which no one has ever disputed on a factual basis, he is now confined to a tiny room that he's inhabited for 5 years now, cut off now even from his only source of communication and contact with the outside world through the internet. And all the while, the governments holding him hostage in the situation are just finding the best, most plausible excuse in order to throw him in a formal prison and quite likely execute him, as Hillary Clinton has been on record saying that she'd like to do with a drone, no less.
Here we have, there's inverse proportion at play here. Many of the people watching this will have no problem at all about deploring what happened to Cicero's tongue, deploring what happened to Socrates, Luther, St. Thomas More. They will declare themselves to be Voltaireans. But the closer to their own period and the closer to their own place that these questions arise, the more difficult it is for them to accept the fact that Julian Assange is the Cicero of our times. He is the Socrates of our times. He is a dissident voice whose tongue has not been cut out, at least not yet, but whose tongue has been stilled. It's been stilled by people and countries and governments and regimes and journalists and broadcasters and so on. It has been stilled because his truth is too recent, too current, too vital to be permitted now.
And therefore, who are we to call, and I mean we in terms of 21st century people, who are we to cast aspersions on the killers of Socrates and of Cicero and of St. Thomas More and of all these other great figures? Who are we to criticize those who silenced Muhammad Ali only for these hypocrites to then praise him in his final years of life? Who are we to say that somehow it's acceptable that mainstream British politicians can praise Mandela as an old man when they called him a terrorist as a young man, when he was actually doing that for which he later received fame as an old man? And so here we are today, where it's now considered standard to think that Socrates was a great man, that Cicero was a great man, that Muhammad Ali was not only the greatest prize fighter, but the greatest thinker of American popular culture at that period, at a time when no one would condemn Mandela, even though they were condemning him just 25, 30 years ago. The people in power today are condemning Assange, not for any of these charges that they threw at him that have now been abrogated by those which initially wrote them down and sealed them upon his fate in the beginning. But Assange is now being held captive because he said the United States and its allies do what people in Western countries are only told people in third world so-called countries do to their dissidents. And that boomerang, another symbol of an indigenous culture, by the way, stolen by Australian settlers, that boomerang has now come back, and Assange is being imprisoned in a tiny piece of a slightly less manic version of Abu Ghraib in the heart of London's richest area, simply because he told the truth, the undisputed truth, about acts of barbarism committed by a powerful country against a weaker country whose citizens' only crime was being born in a weaker country that happened to have oil and a strategic location.
How I wish your sterling words today could reach out across the whole population, and one day I'm certain that your words and the incredible eloquence and erudition with which you express yourself will have a very large audience indeed. As for me, Mr. Ofcom, I can promise you I will not go quietly into your good night. I have been George Galloway.
And I've been Adam Garrett.
And we, the History Boys, thank you for watching.